Alrighty, everybody, welcome to Getting the Answers, episode 5, and we're going to discuss natural law for this episode. And I'm joined today with my co host Anna Voltes, and I am Wyatt Birkenoff, or The Breakdown with Birkenoff. So I guess you could go ahead and kind of introduce us to this topic since you have more of the philosopher's mind, and I think it would be good to start with like a good definition before we get into all the details.
Okay, but before I begin, I'd like to tell those of you who are observant, have a very happy and Merry Christmas, since it is Christmas Eve on the day that we are doing this show. And don't worry about us. We have our own Christmas celebrations, uh, and we are not missing out on those by being here. So if you are not happy this Christmas, I do hope that you do cheer up and be happy. So anyway, getting onto the idea of natural law. Natural law can be defined in a number of different ways, but ultimately, the defining characteristic of natural law is the idea that law, or more specifically, ethical paradigms, ethical absolutes, are linked with nature, and by that it can mean a number of different things. It usually means that natural law is something that arises in nature and can be understood from nature, and is not external to nature in itself.
Right, because I often heard it as an example when researching that they would compare it to like a mother and a child, is kind of how they would introduce natural law and like the most basic sort of understanding of natural law. And I've also seen it compared to like, I guess you would say natural morality, I guess would kind of be the term where they're like, you don't, every human, well, most every human doesn't want to kill another human because they see that as wrong. And they kind of compared that as a natural law type of component too. And obviously, I think they're kind of oversimplifying it maybe a little bit, but it just kind of gives some examples to what natural law is.
Yes, those are some ways to characterize it. And when it is understood through nature, which is usually the primary characteristic of natural law, that it is something to be understood through nature, this can mean a number of different things. It can mean either through instinct, it can mean through observation of nature, it can mean through scientific study of nature, or it can also mean through reason, which is considered a natural quality on this type of analysis.
Right, for sure. There's the three type of trees, like when you do the math, you have the tree diagram. There's like components of each type, I guess is the best way of putting that.
Yes, so there are a number of different viewpoints considering natural law under this taxonomy.
For sure. Which one do you favor the most, or do you think you align the most with in with your understanding?
Okay, and this hopefully it shouldn't come to as a shock to my more longtime viewers, but in my book, Actionable Justice, I actually make a case against the idea of natural law. So I'm actually completely opposed to the idea of natural law.
Okay. So, and you don't see that as being. Oh, I guess the best way. Why are you opposed?
Well, there's a couple of different reasons. One is that I do not see it as being necessarily sequitur, at least from the secular perspective of natural law. Now, there is a religious, and this is probably the more prominent perspective, even though in recent years people use it less frequently, the religious perspective on natural law, which was expounded by Thomas Aquinas, for example, but also to an extent by John Locke and others, is the idea that nature is morally relevant, uh, and has moral impetus on people, moral consequence on people, because nature is backed by God. So,
Mm-hmm.
because God created nature, therefore, nature has moral applications to humans, and that nature is one form of revelation by God to give morality to humans. Now, the first, the non-theistic example on nature having consequence to humans is something that I reject for a few different reasons, and it depends on which type of natural law uh, is used. But I would say that nature does not produce judges, it does not produce judgments, it does not produce a legal process, and therefore I do not consider it as something to be a valid source of laws. Now, that being said, on the theistic side, God, under that understanding, does produce judgments based on people's interaction with nature. However, I take a more legal positivistic perspective, saying that the validity of God's judgments in relation to nature is based more on the authority of God Himself rather than God's interaction with nature, for a couple of reasons. One is that, as Thomas Aquinas argued, that the natural law is not really the primary means of ethics that Thomas Aquinas used. He considered direct revelation to be more relevant, and as such used natural law as a means to explain from his ideas as to why people that are not Christian can be moral. Now, that being said, I view that perspective as undermining the actual essence of the law of God, which is based on the commands of God. And while I do not deny that there is revelation through nature, I would say that more conclusive revelation is held either through metaphysical contact with God or through contact with God's actual denotative commandments. So I view that as being much more relevant in that sense. Furthermore, one of the reasons why I do not consider nature to be too relevant under the theistic perspective is the idea of the corruption of nature. That is to say, the noetic effects of sin. That there's a corruption by sin on the human mind and also on the surrounding environment and the bodies of humans. And because of that, I do not consider those things to be particularly relevant for generating an absolute moral code in the way that some other people would. Uh, but that's, of course, leaning more heavily into a Calvinistic perspective.
Right, yeah. I guess the only way what I kind of interpreted from what you said there and kind of thinking more in like the philosopher's mind perspective is that do you think when they were writing natural law or thinking over natural law, they got the perspective that of comparing it to nature as God's creation because God made nature before anything else? Like basically they're seeing it as God's full scope of what he can do before he even made man.
Um, Well, I would say that man is part of God's creation, so I don't
Right,
think
right.
it's something that can be fully separated in that sense. Although I can say that I would consider that which is natural to be separate from God, at least nature as is generally used. Of course, people can talk about God's nature, and God is not native, as in he's not born. So the term nature can be used in a sense, but it's also it's a bit similar to how the term existence is used by some people colloquially to refer to God, even though from an etymological perspective, it doesn't make sense to use that word. But what I view the perspectives on natural law, what my perspective on what the flaw in the thinking is that under a lot of the natural law philosophers, they are a lot more humanistic. They like to view things through a human perspective. And for a human perspective, uh, if you take the human perspective as a primary perspective, there ends up entering an idea, a philosophical idea, that the laws are necessarily something that have to be known or that have to be knowable in a more full sense, and that people might have an obligation to, or to be more exact, that the lawmaker might have an obligation to automatically inform people of the laws. Now, that being said, I do agree with what is revealed that there are some things about God and that are known through interaction with nature. However, I don't think that such things are as complete an understanding of the law that would give people the ability to be fully in line with the law. Not that that's possible in a general sense, but in a theoretical sense of knowing the law fully and acting upon it. An example I would give is the week, 7 days. That's something that people can say that through working, it makes sense to rest every few days, and that is true. However, uh, that's not really a moral element to it, because the way God describes the 7 day week in the Torah, in the law that God actually gave, it does have a moral weight because the Shabbat is holy. And the only way someone could know that the Shabbat is holy is through actual revelation of God
Right. Yeah.
rather than through interaction with nature. I don't think there's any way somebody could know that without having revelation from God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a definitely valid points, but a lot of times when, especially when you think about philosophers and trying to compare religion, I've heard many ideas around that philosophers are really trying to create laws or perspectives to understand religion, and a lot of times you could see that more as a humanistic approach because some people view religious people as an idea that the only reason they are in that religion is because they're better than you or they feel like they understand something more than you do. I don't know if I'm explaining this too well, but what I'm trying to say is basically a lot of times what I've heard from people is that a lot of philosophers make rules and laws to explain religion so that it makes humans more the focal point. I don't know if natural law is necessarily the case for it, but
Well, I would agree that there is a tendency to do that, and I would say that this is a very natural tendency that people have. And I would also say that even though that this is a natural tendency, that from the religious perspective, this is in fact an immoral tendency. So that's an example of something that's a very natural perspective that then goes against what I would consider to be moral. And I would say that an example of this is how a lot of people historically view ancient cultures as using religion to explain natural phenomena, when in fact, if you actually understand the theology of those ancient cultures, it makes more sense to say that a lot of them were using the natural phenomena as an abstraction of the supernatural, which is the opposite of how the materialist understanding of those cultures interprets them. Because a lot of people use the spiritualization of elements to examine that as an abstract of material elements, when in fact a lot of ancient cultures, the Greeks, the Romans, the Etruscans, viewed it the opposite way. Even Plato, who was not a classical paganist like the others at the time, he had this idea that the material world contains abstractions of more pure forms. Uh, so, in that sense, a lot of people have strongly misunderstood ancient cultures, uh, and and by expansion, various religious cultures.
Right, for sure. I think the strongest case for natural law that I was reading and makes the most sense to me is the instincts part of natural law, basically saying that a lot of people are, you could say, born into having human instincts either because of survival of nature or whatever the case might be. And it does make some sense because when I was reading it, I thought about like the gut feeling that you might have if you think someone's following you or something like that, which is kind of a similar to a survival instinct, I guess you could say. But I mean, it does make sense if that is what it was talking about to me, at least, because I do think that in the base sense, a natural instinct like that can tell you that there's danger around, and there's not really any other area that you could replace it with.
Yes, and I do think that natural instincts are very useful, and that they are very informative, especially for young people that might not have uh, fully developed their ethical paradigms. However, I will say that an example of the failing of the natural man, the failing of the natural body, is the addiction that people can fall into to various substances and to the response in their brains to various stimuli. You have people that are addicted to dopamine highs, and people fall into a lifestyle that ends up being very destructive to themselves. However, I will say that even if people have instincts, just having an instinct, having a natural proclivity to something, doesn't mean that that thing is necessarily good in a grand sense. Even if it might be good for you physically, you have to first define why it is good for you to be alive in the first place. And uh, and once you get to that point, it becomes very difficult to understand things from a naturalist materialist perspective in a moral sense, because if you can't really define what is good for you to be alive, there isn't really much to go on to define why it is good for you to do anything in particular. And that's why you have people that are hedonistic, people that become Epicureans, where they have a lifestyle of, I'm not going to hurt others, but I'm going to just live for my own pleasure. And under a naturalist understanding of morality, what's better about that than simply, dare I say, and you two please don't block me for saying this, committing suicide? What's better than that than committing suicide, or better than that than contributing to the advancement of a society? All of those things don't really have any moral difference in weight under a naturalist understanding.
Yes, I guess the only thing comes to mind with that is when you make a philosophy perspective like natural law, you're kind of talking about not necessarily the perfect human, but at least what you should be living towards or thinking about. So, yes, people kind of drift off from that perspective, but the philosophy itself is still trying to show what you should be, if I'm explaining that right. So, in other words, I don't know if it's fair to necessarily compare it to people who drift off from it if they're still if the philosophy itself still makes sense.
Uh, yeah, that's why I think that moral frameworks that develop deontologies and teleology are much more superior than moral frameworks that simply describe nature. Because under a deontology or a teleology, you have a reason for doing something or a reason not to do something. But under pure natural law, you can say that something will happen, but that doesn't really mean that it should happen or should not happen. So I think that there's a huge is ought problem that natural law can't really resolve.
Right. So you're saying that you're not necessarily a fan of natural law because you see other options that are better than natural law to explain human nature better.
Well, even if I was not aware of those other options, it would still make sense to criticize natural law for that reason.
Right. Because the one thing going against it when I was doing research and kind of what I came up on my own mind before the talk here was that it kind of explains a guideline or steps. I don't know if steps right word, but a area where you should be focused on, but it doesn't necessarily fully demonstrate like how you should live your life. So in other words, it's a good idea, but it's one of those type of things where it's like I kind of need to know more about it to even really understand it to practice it.
Yeah, because here's the deal. Because I had a conversation with Matt Christensen one time, uh, and we couldn't really get on the same footing on what exactly we were talking about. But ultimately, one of the problems that I expressed with natural law was that there's no real reason in under natural law to prefer altruism or egoism, because who gets to interpret nature? Okay, and this is very important because it's not simply a question of what can we say about nature. It's once we've analyzed nature, and once we've analyzed logic, once we've analyzed all these different things, what do they mean? And and that's where you get the problem, because a lot of people say, well, we need to help others, we need to care about others, and then I say, well, why? Okay, because you could also say that once you've analyzed nature, that you should simply care about yourself, and both of those don't really have any difference in validity if you can't establish a hermeneutical, a interpretive framework on how to analyze natural law. And that's the problem with atheistic understanding of natural law, because under that idea, there's no authority behind nature, and therefore nature has to stand on its own merits. And since nature doesn't have uh, its own moral agency as a thing, it doesn't work. And even under the theistic understanding of natural law, as a Christian, I view that human nature is corrupted. And because of that, there needs to be a greater understanding on the hermeneutics of it, because we don't accidentally want to base our ideas on something that is already morally corrupted.
Right. Yeah. I definitely see that perspective, and really the only thing I come back to when arguing against it is the idea of nature as the creation, or the concept of nature. Because if you take the purest perspective of what nature is, of what God made nature to be, nature is almost fully pure. So I get the perspective of someone wanting to explain the way humans are made or how humans act through nature, or at least saying you should be more like nature. I get that perspective, but I definitely get how you can't necessarily fully believe into just natural law. But I do think it does have some credence for how people should go about thinking and living their lives.
Well, about the pure nature, the thing is, we don't have that. Okay, at least from a Christian worldview, we don't have that. We had that, and we could imagine it, but we can't actually look at it and examine it. And therefore, anything that we garner from it is through our human lenses. And that is something that I think is epistemically inferior to God's understanding of things.
Right.
And that's why, for example, I would say that Jesus Christ, he described love your neighbor as yourself, not as something that's obvious from nature, but as a commandment from God in the law and the prophets. So if we so when people take that as an idea and they separate that from the commandment, it no longer has the same moral weight as it previously had, because the underlying moral of loving your neighbor as yourself is the obedience to God. That's why it is a commandment. And therefore, the morality of altruism is ultimately linked into the morality of obedience. And obedience is something that is very difficult to understand uh, from nature itself.
Right. You kind of need something else to go along with it. Is what I'm getting from that. I think that does have some merit to it. It's natural law in a lot of ways seems like an ideal perspective to have if everything kind of was perfect, and obviously nothing, it's not perfect now. And even when Thomas and anyone else who kind of wrote about natural law, it wasn't really perfect then either. But I do think I see their perspective, and I know I probably already said this point before, but I do see how they would compare themselves to nature, or at least look at nature, if they take nature as pure. So I'm not saying that it is pure, but if they view it themselves as pure, for them to write it that way.
Uh, Yes, I do understand that perspective. But of course, as Thomas Aquinas himself would understand, we don't operate, or at least us who are in the know, don't operate based on only having nature. We, as Christians, have the idea that God has spoken, and that therefore that is something that is relevant to us. And that is something that, even in the context of God having spoken, you see in the Old Testament, there's a description of God calling the righteousness of some of the Israelites and comparing it to filthy rags. And that's people that are in the know on this. So I don't think, okay, and this is a deep theological perspective. Unlike Thomas Aquinas, I don't think that there is such a thing as a virtuous pagan, okay? And as such, I don't think that there is such a thing as someone having a complete moral understanding from nature itself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I guess, and this may be a little bit off topic, but I would like to know what type of theory or law would you have over natural law?
Well, uh, there's two theories that I sort of, or three that I sort of combine. There is divine command theory, which is that God speaks, and that is a moral imperative. That is something that is incumbent upon all of us. There is that combined with legal positivism, which is that the laws dictate a morality in a society, and this is based on the idea of God having established the laws in the society, and therefore is subordinate to divine command theory, and also an idea of consequentialism. What makes God's law relevant and powerful is that it is it has energy. That is to say, in the Aristotelian sense, energeia, it is actionable, it has power. And because it has power, it is something that is relevant and incumbent to us. Because if it did not have power, then we could disobey it and nothing would happen. And you could still say that there is a morality to it, but then at that point, it's just somebody's opinion. But if it has power, and if that power is exercised, and we do believe that that power is exercised for the God's final judgment, then it is something that is morally relevant to us.
Right, gotcha, yep. Yep, because I could definitely see natural law as being, I guess a good word is simplistic to what it's trying to do and describe. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily think that it is fully wrong either, because I do think it has credence with, like I said before, mostly with instincts. Now, instincts aren't obviously perfect, but I do think that they have some sort of natural explanation to why we have, I guess you could say, lived so long as humans.
Yes, I do think that God does. Let me once again reiterate before anyone assumes my position. I do believe that God does reveal some things through nature and through instincts. However, I don't think that it is a sufficient revelation.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think you could definitely argue that point because instincts aren't necessarily something that happens very often either. I mean, I guess it would depend on your circumstance, like where you live or anything particular to that part. But I would say like the average human doesn't necessarily use their instincts every day or every other day or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before with the question of addiction, sometimes your instincts actually lead you into negative situations.
Right. Yes,
So it
it's not all roses.
yeah, some people, because you look at people that don't control themselves, because I think self-control is something that's very important. And someone that follows all their instincts and is a and makes their reason a slave to their emotion ultimately ends up becoming the kind of person that gets angry unreasonably, that gets frightful unreasonably, someone that gets affectionate in an unreasonably way, and that ends up producing a lot of harm and damage in our society. Not saying that the harm and the damage is what defines what the morality is, but what I am saying is that it is demonstrably, from a consequentialist perspective, damaging to not have self control.
Would you say self control leads itself to natural law as a bad example, or what do you mean by the self control part?
Well, if we take instincts and your natural stimulus response reactions as a basis for natural law, then I do think that self control is in contrast. Now, some people use reason as a part of natural law, and under that idea, self control would be considered part of natural. So there are different perspectives on this.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, because I didn't really necessarily read anything too much talking about self control as part of it, but I can definitely see how it could be an extension off of instincts, or yeah, an extension off of instincts. Yeah.
Indeed. So what is your current position then?
My current position on natural law, and basically how I view natural law, and this may not even be a perfect perspective. This is just what I view it as. I see natural law as an idea that makes some sense in how you should live your lives and explains kind of how instincts are involved within your human nature and how God may have planned that in particular. And so I see it all as there. And I also see natural law as more of something I don't think you can fully take natural law as your like top philosophy. Like this is what you're going to preach or what you believe in fully, because I don't think it's necessarily complete in its perspective or approach. I do think I like natural law, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the only thing you can think about when you try to think about God and His plan of nature or plan of man. So I guess if you wanted like a super simplistic version of what I think is, I like natural law, but I don't think it's necessarily complete to have a full perspective on.
Uh, yes, I do agree with that. That it is quite appealing to a lot of people, and in my view, it's not. It doesn't. It doesn't pass intellectual rigor to be a sufficient uh, ethical paradigm.
hmm What do you think about the whole idea of natural law being used in like actual law in the justice system?
Um, I don't like that idea because very frequently people use it in a way that asserts something, and then the question is who gets to interpret nature. And ultimately, the interpreter of nature is the lawmaker himself. And then what we have is, I would say, a legal fiction, a deceptive element in the law, in that it's what's actually being represented is not nature as a whole, because nature isn't morally incumbent on anyone, but rather the particular opinions and desires of the lawmaker in under a type of legal positivism, that is the actual fact of what is happening as opposed to the fiction of what is happening. So I think that lawmakers should be more intellectually consistent in representing their laws as something that is either coming out of their own preference or their own understanding of something, rather than abstracting it to nature, where in my opinion, doesn't really stand up to reason.
Right, got you. Because I can understand it from the most basic understanding of natural law, like I explained at the very beginning, that no human should ever kill another human. And a lot of people see that as an example of natural law in a lot of ways. And I could see that perspective in the justice system because, I mean, obviously we already have guidelines for that through murder, manslaughter. You have all these different tiers of what that is. So I could see that perspective, but I definitely don't see it as being like, this is the only theory that I'm going to use when deciding people's faiths.
Yeah, I personally think that there are some very legitimate reasons to kill others, and therefore making a statement no one should ever kill another person, in my view, doesn't make sense. And I think that from a perspective of legal enforcement, and I would say legal realism and legal positivism, killing people for the sake of the law is something that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because I was reading a couple of articles where they were comparing natural law to self defense because it seemed like a weakness of natural law that it doesn't necessarily cover the whole claim of killing somebody and being justified in doing so because they're coming after you or your family or whatever the case might be.
Yes, because capital punishment is frequently used in a way as a form of self-defense, either against a threat to the society that is underlying the legal system, or as a defense for the state that is implementing the legal system. And similarly, war, uh, killing in war is very frequently a type of defense.
Right, yeah, for sure. And this comment is sort of relevant to what we were talking about, so I'll go ahead and read it here. This was by Star Slice, and they say, try natural law in court and see where you get. So I don't I don't think that is necessarily a theory that you could ultimately rely on.
Yeah, if someone were to actually go into court and say your laws are against nature, then what the judge can simply say is he can either disagree and say, actually, in my interpretation, they are entirely in line with nature, or okay, he can simply ignore him and say, well, these laws aren't nature; these are the actual laws that we have in our society, and you're going to have to deal with them. So I if I were a judge, I would not caution, I would not countenance, I would say, the use of natural law in a court of law.
Right, yeah, because I think you kind of explained very well that even the basis approach of the idea that no human should kill another human could potentially be wrong in itself because of self defense, and natural law doesn't necessarily talk about self defense, as we also kind of explained a little bit as well. So even you could say in just a very
Well,
basic perspective of the court
I'm
system.
gonna be honest here. I do think that natural law proponents can make arguments for self defense internally in natural law. Now, because I don't think natural law in itself is a coherent system, I wouldn't say that it makes sense. But if you grant that natural law is coherent, then I think that people could make natural law arguments for self defense.
And how would you go about arguing that? Just out of curiosity.
Well, okay, okay. This is a bit harder because since I've already rejected the idea, now I have to intellectually act as if it were true. So, under natural law, we say in nature, what is important is one's survival in order to perpetuate oneself into the future. And if someone comes to kill you, then it makes sense to defend yourself. And it is, in fact, instinctive that one might defend himself and would be opposed to one's own destruction.
Right. Yep. I could see that. Yep. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily
Now
think
the
that.
counter argument, from my perspective, is well, some people choose to kill themselves. And
Hmm.
that's something that natural law can try to explain, but it's something that I don't think they can make a decent argument as to why that's any worse than choosing to live. So there you go. So I don't think that there's a very coherent argument in natural law. However, a lot of people like to dress up arguments, and to a lot of people, it works.
Right. Yep. This is also from Star Slice. I was just going to make sure if you agree with what he said here, or she. Natural law comes from God. It is authoritative over all human beings, and it is learnable by all human beings. I don't know if you necessarily agree with that or what your thoughts are of that claim.
Well, I would say that that is objectively false because A, nature has been corrupted, as is known in the scriptures, and B, God has given a law that is not, and the law itself does have a purpose to inform people to some extent. So it can't be argued that it is just an addendum to natural law. And elements of a law that have moral relevance are not discernible through a natural law understanding.
Because I think the very basis of that claim, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the question too, but ultimately these type of laws and philosophy get written by man themselves trying to understand what God made. So the idea that it comes directly from God could be misinterpreted as well, because they don't know for sure if that's what God was thinking.
Yeah. I say there's no salvation except that of Jesus Christ, and where in nature can you find that out?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people don't have revelation in nature. I'm not saying that people aren't graced in nature. Let me be very clear on that. I am saying, however, that if we are going to make a reasonable argument, we need a hermeneutic for understanding nature, and that is something that nature itself cannot provide us. Therefore, nature alone can't really prove anything in a strong moral sense. It might prove things in a light sense, but not as strongly as the actual revelation of God. And it is for this reason that Jesus Christ and the apostles spoke very strongly of God's commandments, more so than they did of nature or imitation of God.
Right, and they had a question also. Could you make an argument that divorces God's authority over nature?
So an argument that goes against God's authority over nature.
Yes, that's how I interpreted the question.
No.
Yes.
Uh, I don't think that I could make such an argument. And I don't know what exactly he's asking. Is he asking an argument on natural law without God, or an argument on how God is not in power over nature? Because I believe that God is sovereign over everything, even the evil ones. So, in that sense, it wouldn't make sense for me to say that God doesn't have authority over evil things.
Yeah, I think that he does have authority as well, and I don't know if that's exactly what he or she was talking about there, and I think they clarified it here. It says right, God is over all humans, correct? So I think they're asking an approach of how much does God control, maybe, or a claim like that.
Yes, I believe that God is sovereign over everyone and everything, and therefore God's sovereignty over something does not necessarily mean that that thing is a source of moral authority, just like God's sovereignty over the Babylonians to invade the Israelites, and his prophecy and his providence for that happening doesn't grant any particular special moral authority to the Babylonians.
Right. I definitely could see that point, and I think that Star
Yeah,
Slice
or
is
the verse where it talks about God sending lying spirits into the mouths of false prophets. So that's or hardening Pharaoh's heart. There's all sorts of examples where God is involved in something, but the thing that God is involved in doesn't reach a special moral authority because of God's involvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're just trying to get your understanding of where you place God in the overall scheme of things. Because I think that from my interpretation of some of the other comments here, is their perspective is that they think that natural law is valid. I don't know to what extent they think it's valid, but they may take a similar perspective to me in that, and it's hard to tell from the comments they have placed. But I think they see natural law as the idea or the perspective that God placed nature in, or a component off of nature.
Yeah, and God created nature, and God uses nature as a revelatory mechanism. But I don't think that nature is the complete and sufficient mechanism by which God expresses his moral demands.
Right. You take I don't think authoritative is the better perspective, but more of a commandments perspective, I guess is the way to put it, than an actual nature perspective.
Yeah, divine command theory. Yeah,
Yeah, right. I was trying to remember what you said earlier. Divine command theory, yeah, over natural law.
yeah. God speaks, and so it is.
Right. And you can see that in the Bible in several examples as well. So I do think it has credence from that route too.
Yeah, and that's why the summary of the whole law and prophets is characterized as commandments.
Right.
The one that Jesus makes, loving God and loving your neighbor. Those are commandments. Those aren't things that are from nature. Those aren't things that are imitations based on descriptions of God. Those are commandments by God. And that is the core of the moral understanding that Jesus expressed of the Old Testament.
What do you think about the idea or claim that natural law may not be able to be used in the court of law, but could be used between like neighbors or local communities to discuss issues of whatever might be happening, like from a small issue like a where should I put my fence to a more bigger issue type of thing?
Well, if you're trying to set up your fence somewhere, uh, in most societies we live in, we have actual written laws that talk about that,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and God commands us to be obedient to the authorities that are making these. So I think that that makes sense. Now, let's say hypothetically, you live in an area where there isn't a clear uh, law on exactly how that should be done. Then the question would be who has the authority in that reason in that region to make a judgment on what should be done in that situation if a dispute arises. And if there is no one that can do that, then you really have a problem, and it has to be resolved between the people involved.
Right, for sure. And I do think that that's a very even modern perspective, but I definitely know from your philosophy in the book you read, and I want to read it myself before I talk too much about your philosophy because I don't want to say something you haven't said before. But you basically take authority as a very high perspective in your situation. So it makes sense that it would go to authority first before like just trying to work it between a more natural law perspective or human to human perspective.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that people can't come to an agreement, and people do come to agreements. What I am saying is that if there is a law, then that law must be obeyed.
Right. And that makes sense. There's I don't think you can necessarily argue against that for sure. I don't know if you had any questions that we haven't hit on yet or anything.
No, nothing in particular.
Okay. I'll see if they had any more questions because they had some pretty good ones. Yeah, they had the neighbor question. That's probably where I got that from. Yeah. And they were just trying to see your perspective on where you place God and not trap you. So I was right about that perspective for natural law and the scope of God, I guess you could say. I don't think I necessarily
Yeah,
have any questions more either. But go on.
because I let me be very clear. I agree with Thomas Aquinas on the idea that God is behind it all. That the point where we disagree is how much of nature is morally incumbent upon people as a mechanism of God's expression of His will. I focus more on the idea of God's will expressed through His revelation. Thomas Aquinas, uh, while he considers God's will as expressed through revelation to be higher than God's will as expressed through nature, views God's will as expressed through nature to be morally significant enough, which is the point at which I disagree with it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's ultimately the scope of how you see nature, I guess, is the best way to put that claim, or at least what I interpreted from what you've been saying. Because like I said before, I
Yeah.
see natural law as a stepping stone to trying to maybe solve the problem or what you should be thinking about, but definitely not something you can use to decide everything.
Yeah. And I view man's natural state to be fallen, and as such, I take a negative uh, bias against using human understanding to attempt to create a moral framework rather than having the direct revelation of God.
Right, yeah.
Now,
And,
some people have a positive view on human nature, and therefore they are more positive in how they understand that. But I don't.
right, for sure. I don't think I have any other questions, so I'll leave it to you if you have any questions. I don't think you did either.
No, I think we did some good time, and we covered quite a bit of ground on the topic. If there is a related topic that people would like to talk about or like to have us talk about, please put it down in the comments section below, and we may discuss that.
Yes, of course. And we, just for newcomers who might be we stumbling upon it now or later on, we stream every Thursday. So next Thursday is going to be on Anna Volta's channel. And we don't have a topic yet, but we will definitely have a topic beforehand. And if we see a relative topic like you were mentioning, we might do that as well. We'll definitely take ideas for topics for sure. So we'll be on Anna Volta's channel next Thursday. So you could catch us there in 10 Central Time as well. We should probably stick to that time.
Yeah, 10 Central, 11 Eastern is when we usually do it.
Yes. Alrighty, and thank you for everybody that's watching now or watching later. I highly appreciate it. And if you like what you hear, make sure to go to Anavelta's channel and check out more what he has to say, or like and subscribe to mine. Just do whatever you want to do, and I highly appreciate you checking us out, and hopefully you liked it.
Yeah, have a Merry Christmas.